The dawn broke hesitant and grey over the Duke of Ashford's estate, as though the morning itself understood the weight of what was to come, and the mist clung to the sculpted hedges of the garden like a lover reluctant to depart, veiling the roses in their pearl-white shroud, while dew trembled upon every leaf and petal, as if the very earth wept in anticipation. Lady Eleanor stood beneath the ancient oak at the garden's heart, her morning dress of pale blue silk darkening at the hem where it brushed the wet grass, and her hands, those delicate hands that had learned over these past months to rest so naturally in the Duke's now twisted together before her, fingers lacing and unlacing in a rhythm that betrayed the turmoil her serene expression sought to conceal. She had risen before the household stirred, compelled by an unease she could not name, drawn to this place where she and the Duke had walked so many evenings during their courtship, where an arrangement brokered between families had transformed, petal by careful petal, into something far more precious and terrifying. Genuine affection, perhaps even love, though she had guarded her heart too carefully to name it so. The wedding was mere days away, the invitations sent, the chapel prepared, her trousseau completed with all the meticulous care befitting a union between two great houses, and yet here she stood alone in the half-light, watching the mist shift and swirl as though it held secrets she ought to divine. The sound of boots upon gravel announced him before she saw him, and when the Duke emerged from the fog, he seemed a figure from legend, tall and grave in his dark coat. His jaw set in that way she had learned meant he wrestled with something difficult, and her heart, that treacherous organ, lurched at the sight of him, even as dread coiled cold in her stomach. "Eleanor," he said, and his voice carried the weight of iron and ash, "I have received word from London." She knew before he spoke further, knew from the military dispatch he clutched in one hand, and the anguish that flickered across his features before discipline mastered it once more, and she felt the ground beneath her shift as though the earth itself had grown unsteady. War had erupted on the continent, some powder keg of alliances and ancient grievances finally igniting, and his regiment, his duty, called him hence with the inexorable pull of honor and obligation. "I must leave within the hour," he continued, stepping closer, and she could see now the conflict warring in his eyes, duty battling desire in a contest where she already knew which would triumph, for she had always understood this about him, that his sense of responsibility to crown and country ran deeper than his bones, was woven into the very fabric of his character, and it was partly why she had allowed herself to care for him at all. They stood facing one another in the garden that had witnessed the gradual unfurling of their connection, and Eleanor found her voice at last, though it emerged smaller than she intended. "And the wedding?" His jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath the skin, and he reached for her hands, enfolding them in his own, with a gentleness that made her throat constrict. "I cannot say when I shall return," he said, each word seeming to cost him. "The campaign may be swift, or it may drag on for months, and I—" He paused, drew breath, and then spoke the words that would echo through all the hollow days to come. "Don't wait for me, Eleanor." The mist swirled between them, already claiming him, already making him ghostly and distant, and though she wanted to protest, to argue, to demand he explain what he meant by such a terrible request, she found herself nodding instead, her vision blurring with tears she refused to let fall, and then he was gone, striding back toward the house to gather his things and ride toward a war that would consume far more than anyone standing in that grey garden could possibly have imagined. But before our lover's fate is revealed, subscribe so you never miss a chapter of romance and scandal, and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Now, let's begin. The weeks that followed the Duke's departure unfurled with a peculiar quality of unreality, as though Eleanor moved through her days encased in glass, observing the dismantling of her anticipated future with a detachment that frightened her even as it numbed the sharper edges of her pain, and the wedding preparations that had consumed the household were methodically undone, like a tapestry unraveled thread. By careful thread, the flowers cancelled, the musicians dismissed, the chapel decorations packed away in tissue and stored in trunks that were carried to the attic, where they gathered dust, like abandoned dreams. She retreated to the countryside estate, unable to bear the pitying glances of London society or the whispered speculation about what had transpired, and in the solitude of rolling hills and ancient gardens, she attempted to cultivate some semblance of equilibrium though her mother's worried eyes followed her through every room, and her father's studied silence spoke volumes about concerns he would not voice. The letters began arriving in the third week, carried by military dispatch and bearing the Duke's seal, and Eleanor's hands trembled each time she broke the wax and unfolded the pages, searching desperately for some warmth, some indication that he regretted his parting words or longed for her as she found herself longing for him, despite every effort to excise such foolish sentiment from her heart. But the letters were formal, almost impersonal, filled with accounts of troop movements and strategic considerations, written in the clipped language of duty rather than affection, and they arrived sporadically one week, bringing 2, the next bringing none, the irregular rhythm preventing her from establishing even the comfort of anticipated correspondence. She tried to maintain hope, tried to believe that his reserve stemmed from the necessities of war rather than genuine indifference, yet always his words echoed in the hollow spaces of her heart. "Don't wait for me." What had he meant? Had it been kindness, releasing her from obligation should he not return? Or had it been something colder, a recognition that their arranged betrothal had been merely that an arrangement and that genuine affection had existed only in her imagination, her heart reading into his courtesy what it wished to find? Autumn arrived with its burden of falling leaves, the gardens surrendering their green vitality to rust and gold, and Eleanor watched the transformation from her window seat with a melancholy that settled into her bones like the creeping chill in the air. And it was during one such vigil that her mother entered the sitting room with tea, and that careful, gentle expression Eleanor had come to dread. "My darling," her mother began, settling beside her with a rustle of silk, "I know your heart is tender still, but perhaps it is time to consider that the Duke gave you permission, indeed, instruction not to remain bound to an uncertain future." Eleanor's fingers tightened on the book she was not reading, her gaze remaining fixed on the window where rain had begun to streak the glass like tears. "He asked you not to wait," her mother continued softly, "and while I know you care for him, there are other prospects, other gentlemen of good character who would count themselves fortunate beyond measure to win your regard. And you are young yet, my dear, too young to consign yourself to indefinite solitude for a man who may not." She did not finish the sentence, but Eleanor heard the unspoken words nonetheless. A man who may not return, a man who may not wish her to wait, a man who had released her for reasons she could not fathom and might never understand. Winter descended upon the countryside with a silence more profound than the cessation of bird song or the stilling of wind through bare branches, for it was in December that the letters stopped arriving altogether, and Eleanor found herself checking the post with a desperation that shamed her even as she could not cease the habit, her heart leaping and then plummeting with each day that brought no word, no sign, no evidence that the Duke yet lived or remembered her existence. Rumours reached England like ravens bearing ill tidings, accounts of brutal campaigns in frozen mountain passes, of regiments decimated by enemy fire, and harsher still by winter's merciless cold, of field hospitals overwhelmed and supply lines severed. And though no official casualty lists bore the Duke's name, the absence of confirmation provided no comfort when silence itself became a harbinger of loss. Eleanor maintained her vigil through the darkest months, rising each morning to dress with care though no one called, sitting by windows that framed landscapes bleached of color, her needlework abandoned in her lap as her gaze drifted to horizons that would not yield what she sought, and she felt herself transforming in ways both subtle and irreversible. The hopeful bride who had stood in the misty garden, becoming something harder, more resigned, a woman learning to survive the slow death of possibility. It was during this season of ice and silence that Viscount Harrington began calling at the estate, a neighbour whose lands bordered her father's, and whose character had always been marked by a kindness that bordered on gentleness, unusual in a man of his station. And his visits were at first merely courteous inquiries about her family's health, invitations to small gatherings that might lift her spirits. But Eleanor recognized in his steady attention something more deliberate, taking shape, though she could not yet name whether this realization brought relief or a deeper species of grief. The Viscount never pressed, never presumed, but his presence became a constant through those frozen weeks, and she found herself accepting his company with gratitude that warred with guilt, for how could she welcome another man's attention when her heart still ached for the Duke, when every night she lay awake, wondering if he shivered in some distant trench or lay cold beneath foreign soil. And yet, the Duke himself had told her not to wait, had released her from obligation with words she could neither forget nor fully comprehend. The internal conflict consumed her through sleepless nights, until she could no longer distinguish between honoring the Duke's wishes and surrendering to the exhaustion of endless, unanswered hope. And it was on a morning in late February, when frost still etched patterns on the windows, that Eleanor descended the stairs and realized she had forgotten to put on the betrothal ring that had lived on her finger since the Duke first placed it there, and rather than return to her chamber to retrieve it, she continued to breakfast with naked hands. And this small omission felt less like betrayal than like the first honest acknowledgement of a truth she had been denying, that she was waiting for a man who had expressly asked her not to, hoping for a future he had deliberately declined to promise, and that perhaps the time had come to accept that some stories ended not with dramatic conclusion, but with gradual, aching fade into silence. Spring arrived with its inevitable renewal, daffodils pushing through earth still cold from winter's grip, and it was on an April morning, when mist hung low over the meadows, that Viscount Harrington requested a private audience with Eleanor in the estate's conservatory, and she knew before he spoke what words would come. He had seen them forming in his careful attentions through the barren months, in the way his gaze lingered on her face, as though memorizing features he hoped to claim the right to study always. And when he knelt before her among the potted roses, her mother cultivated against the season's chill, his proposal was everything that should have made her heart sing, gentle, respectful, offering not passionate declarations but steady devotion, a partnership built on friendship and mutual regard, the promise of a peaceful life, untroubled by the storms that had battered her spirit these 11 months past. Nearly a year had passed since the Duke's departure, and Eleanor stood at the precipice of decision, feeling as though she observed herself from a great distance, watching a woman who bore her face accept a kind man's hand, while some essential part of her remained frozen in a misty garden at dawn, forever waiting for a man who had explicitly released her from such waiting. And that night she did not sleep, but sat instead by her chamber window, reviewing the architecture of her choice, as one might examine the foundations of a building before committing to construct upon them. The Duke had told her not to wait, had spoken those words with what she had interpreted as finality, as permission, or perhaps even instruction, to forge a future that did not include him, and in the months of silence that followed, she had received no correction to this understanding, no letter pleading for her patience or declaring intentions to return and claim what they had begun to build together. And was it not the height of foolishness to decline a genuine offer of marriage for the ghost of one that had never materialized, to reject present certainty for past possibility, to choose solitude over companionship, because her heart had not yet learned to relinquish what her mind knew to be lost? She thought of the Viscount's kindness, his unwavering presence through her darkest season, and she thought of the Duke's absence, his formal letters that had ceased entirely, his parting words that echoed still with their terrible ambiguity. And in the grey hour before dawn, she reached a conclusion that felt less like choice than like surrender to inevitability, reasoning that she was honoring the Duke's wishes rather than betraying them, that he had given her this freedom deliberately, and she dishonored his sacrifice by refusing to exercise it. And when morning came, she descended to breakfast and gave the Viscount her acceptance, and her voice when she spoke was steady, even as her heart fractured along fault lines she had thought already broken beyond further damage. The engagement announcement was prepared with efficient swiftness, her mother's relief palpable as she supervised the wording that would appear in the London papers, and Eleanor moved through the preparations with a composure that felt like armor, protecting others from witnessing the hollowness within. And she thought that she should have been a joyful bride making these arrangements, should have felt anticipation rather than this numb acceptance. But joy seemed a language she had forgotten how to speak, and she told herself that contentment might be enough, that steady regard might sustain where passion had only brought pain. And the announcement was dispatched to the Times and the Morning Post, and she imagined it travelling to London, where perhaps someone might read it and think of a duke who had gone to war, and she wondered if he would see it, if he yet lived to see anything at all, and whether he would feel relief that she had heeded his instruction, or if some part of him might mourn what they had lost to duty and distance, and words spoken in haste that could never be recalled. The Duke of Ashford returned to England on a morning when fog clung to the Thames like spectral shrouds, his arrival unannounced because he had travelled with urgent haste from the continent, leaving behind the regiment he had commanded through 11 months of brutal campaign, and he was changed in ways both visible and invisible, his frame leaner, his face marked by a scar that ran from temple to jaw, his eyes carrying shadows that had not existed when he departed, though these physical alterations were nothing compared to the transformation wrought within, for he had survived hell's own crucible, with one singular thought sustaining him through frozen nights and blood-soaked dawns. The memory of Eleanor's face as she had stood in the garden at dawn, the promise of a future that awaited his return, the certainty that she would be there when this nightmare ended, and it was this certainty that propelled him now through London streets, still waking to morning commerce, his travel-stained clothes drawing curious glances as his carriage clattered over cobblestones toward the Mayfair residence he had not seen in nearly a year. His man of business met him at the door with expressions of relief and concern mingled, for no word had come of the Duke's return, and the household had existed in a state of anxious suspension, but the Duke brushed aside inquiries about his health and comfort, requesting only that bath water be drawn and fresh clothes prepared, and it was while his valet attended these tasks that he descended to the study, where correspondence accumulated in neat stacks awaiting his attention, and among these papers he found the morning edition of the Times, placed as always upon the leather desk blotter, and he took up the paper with the intention of learning what had transpired in his absence, what political shifts and social movements had occupied a world that seemed impossibly distant from the trenches and field hospitals that had consumed his recent existence. The announcement appeared on page 4, nestled between accounts of parliamentary proceedings and advertisements for spring entertainments, and the Duke's eyes fell upon the words with the same incomprehension one might experience when struck by lightning, sudden, complete, devastating beyond immediate understanding, and he read the text once, then again, then a third time as though repetition might alter the meaning. The engagement of Lady Eleanor Ashworth to Viscount Harrington, the wedding planned for June at the family estate, the congratulations extended by families of both parties to this advantageous union. The newspaper fell from his hands, drifting to the carpet with the weightlessness of something insubstantial, though the words it contained possessed terrible gravity, and the Duke stood frozen as understanding crashed over him in waves she had not waited. She had accepted another. The future he had clung to through the darkest nights existed only in his imagination, and it was only then, as his legs gave way and he sank into the desk chair as though his bones had turned to water, that fragmentary memories assembled themselves into crushing comprehension. The letters he had written by candlelight in frozen tents, pouring out his heart with an honesty that would have shamed his earlier formal correspondence, confessing his love and his longing and his desperate counting of days until he might return to claim what they had begun to build together. All these letters entrusted to a courier who had perished when their supply convoy was ambushed in a mountain pass, the missives scattered to foreign winds or burned or lost forever, never reaching their intended recipient, and Eleanor receiving instead only silence, void, absence. And she had interpreted this void as abandonment when he had meant it as nothing of the kind. The injury that had delayed his return by 6 weeks, the fever that had nearly claimed him in a field hospital, where he had forbidden his attendants to send word home because he could not bear for Eleanor to receive news of his illness when he intended to recover and return to her whole. This injury suddenly transformed from mere inconvenience to catastrophic error in judgment, for those 6 weeks had apparently been precisely the window during which Eleanor had made her choice, had accepted another man's proposal, had decided that the future lay not with a duke who had vanished into war, but with a viscount who remained present, and the Duke sat in his silent study, with dawn light creeping through windows, overlooking gardens he had not seen in 11 months, and felt the world he had fought to return to crumbling like ash between his fingers, the announcement in the Times marking not his homecoming but his devastation, not reunion but irrevocable loss, and the crisis that had been building through months of separation and silence now crystallized into a single, terrible truth. He had survived the war, only to discover that the battle he needed to fight had already been lost while he bled on foreign soil, and his own words spoken in haste and misunderstood in anguish had destroyed the very future he had endured everything to reclaim. The Duke rode through the night without regard for exhaustion or propriety. His horse's hooves thunder against the roads that led from London to the Ashworth estate, and he arrived as dawn broke over fields still wet with dew, his appearance wild and desperate as he dismounted before the manor house, where servants emerging for morning duties startled at the sight of him, and he demanded to see Lady Eleanor with an authority that permitted no refusal, though the butler's expression registered profound discomfort as he announced that the lady was not yet receiving visitors at such an hour. But the Duke pushed past these protestations and into the entrance hall, just as Eleanor descended the staircase wrapped in a morning shawl, her hair still loose about her shoulders, and the sight of her struck him with physical force alive. Whole, more beautiful even than memory had preserved, and for a moment neither could speak, the air between them thick with tension, as though the very atmosphere had condensed into something solid and impenetrable. Eleanor's face drained of color as recognition crashed over her, one hand gripping the banister as though her legs might otherwise fail, and she whispered his name like a word from a forgotten language, disbelief and shock, and something that might have been joy warring across her features, before shuddering into careful blankness. And the Duke saw this transformation, saw her armor herself against him, and it kindled fury alongside his anguish, because how dare she look at him as though he were a stranger, when he had survived damnation itself to return to her. And his voice when he spoke was raw, stripped of the careful control that usually governed his speech. "Why?" he demanded, advancing toward the base of the stairs where she stood frozen, and the single word contained universes of accusation and devastation, and Eleanor flinched as though he had struck her, her composure cracking as she descended the remaining steps with careful dignity, gesturing toward the morning room, where they might speak privately away from the servants who had begun to gather in doorways, their curiosity barely concealed, and once the door closed behind them, she turned to face him, and her voice was quiet but steady as she asked what right he had to arrive unannounced and demand explanations when he had abandoned her to silence and absence. And the Duke felt his control, fracturing as he spoke of battles and blood, and frozen nights where her memory sustained him, of letters written and lost and injuries unreported, and Eleanor listened with growing horror as understanding began to dawn. But she interrupted him with terrible gentleness to recite his own words back to him, the words he had spoken in the garden 11 months ago. "Don't wait for me." And the Duke staggered, as though she had driven a blade between his ribs, because yes, he had spoken those words, but she had misunderstood them so completely that it would have been laughable if it were not destroying them both. "I meant don't wait for letters during active campaign," he said hoarsely, closing the distance between them until mere feet separated them, near enough that he could see the tears gathering in her eyes, though she fought to contain them. "I meant the military post would be unreliable, that you should not expect regular correspondence, not that you should forget our betrothal, forget what we had begun to build, forget me entirely, and accept another man's proposal." And Eleanor swayed slightly as the full weight of their mutual misunderstanding settled upon her shoulders, her hand rising to her throat as though she could not breathe, and she whispered that his letters had been so formal, so distant, that they had stopped coming altogether, that she had interpreted his silence as confirmation of his words, as permission, or perhaps instruction, to release him from obligations spoken before he understood the reality of war. And the Duke shook his head violently, his voice breaking as he told her of the letters she had never received, the passionate declarations that had burned in foreign fires or scattered across mountain passes, all the words he had written, confessing that she was his reason for surviving, his light in darkness, his future and his hope. And Eleanor's tears spilled over as she realized the tragedy of their separation, how words spoken in haste and misunderstood in anguish had demolished what they had built, how silence had been interpreted as abandonment when it had been nothing but cruel circumstance. And the Duke reached for her hands, and Eleanor let him take them. And for a moment they stood in the morning light with the truth finally laid bare between them, the terrible, beautiful, devastating truth that they had both been faithful in their hearts while believing themselves abandoned, that miscommunication and misfortune had conspired to destroy what neither of them had willingly relinquished, and the realization that settled over them both was this: they had loved each other through the darkness, but understanding had come too late, for Eleanor wore another man's betrothal ring, and honor now demanded what love could not overcome. Eleanor felt the morning room close around her like a vice, as the full weight of impossibility settled upon her shoulders, for standing before her was the man she had never stopped loving despite every effort to excise him from her heart. And he had just revealed that their separation had been built upon tragic misunderstanding rather than intentional abandonment, that he had loved her through every moment of their parting, just as she had loved him. But this knowledge, which should have brought joy, instead delivered only fresh anguish because she wore another man's ring upon her finger, had given her word to the Viscount, who had offered kindness when she believed herself abandoned, and honor demanded she keep faith with promises made, even when her heart screamed rebellion against the cruelty of timing and fate. The Duke seemed to read her thoughts in the anguish written across her features, and his voice, when he spoke again, was quieter, steadier, though she could hear how it cost him to maintain composure, and he told her of nights in frozen trenches, when he had closed his eyes and summoned her face to drive back the darkness, of moments in battle when fear threatened to overwhelm, and he had whispered her name like a talisman against death, of the future he had constructed in his imagination during endless hours of marching and waiting and surviving, a future that contained her laughter in corridors of his estate, her presence across breakfast tables, her wisdom in partnership, her love as the foundation upon which he would rebuild himself from the broken thing war had made him. And Eleanor felt tears streaming down her cheeks unchecked as she listened to this confession that mirrored her own secret heart, for she too had clung to memories of him through the hollow months, had tried desperately to transfer her affections to the Viscount, and failed utterly, had accepted his proposal not from love but from resignation, from the belief that the Duke had released her to find happiness elsewhere, and now to discover that neither of them had willingly relinquished what they had begun to build together was a torture more exquisite than clean separation would have been. "I tried to stop loving you," she whispered, the admission torn from depths she had not acknowledged even to herself, and the Duke moved closer until only inches separated them, his hand still holding hers, as though he feared she might vanish if he released her, and his eyes searched her face with desperate intensity as she continued, "I tried every method I knew. I burned your letters. I forbade myself to speak your name. I accepted the Viscount's courtship, hoping that proximity and kindness might kindle what had existed between us. But every attempt only proved how thoroughly you had claimed parts of me I could not reclaim, and I wear his ring now, not from love but from duty, from the promise I made when I believed you had chosen war over what we might have built together." And the Duke's expression transformed from anguish to something fierce and possessive and utterly devastated as he raised one hand to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing away tears that continued to fall, and for a moment they stood suspended in that charged space where past and present collided, where love and honor warred for supremacy, where the tragic absurdity of their situation crystallized into sharp relief. They had both been faithful to love that should never have been tested, but circumstance and miscommunication had placed them on opposite sides of an unbridgeable chasm. For Eleanor's integrity would not permit her to break faith with the Viscount, who had offered marriage in good faith, and the Duke's own code of honor, much as it killed him, demanded he respect her commitment even as it destroyed him. And so they stood in the morning light with truth finally spoken, and love finally confessed, and future finally, irrevocably impossible, bound by the very qualities of character that had drawn them to each other in the first place. And the Duke's voice was barely above a whisper when he said he would not ask her to compromise her honor even for love, that he respected her integrity too deeply to request she become someone other than the woman he had survived hell to return to. But his eyes told a different story. They spoke of devastation and longing, and the knowledge that he would carry this loss like shrapnel lodged too close to his heart to ever be fully excised, a wound that would ache with every breath for the remainder of his days. The weeks crawled forward with the particular cruelty of time that refuses to relieve suffering, each day stretching into eternity while simultaneously racing toward a wedding. Eleanor could not bear to contemplate, and in his London townhouse the Duke of Ashford existed in a state that his valet described with concern to the housekeeper as a living death. For he remained closeted in his study from dawn until the small hours of the morning, declining meals that arrived on trays and were removed untouched, dismissing visitors with curt refusals, and spending his hours staring at documents he did not read, while his mind replayed every moment of that devastating conversation in the morning room, every word Eleanor had spoken, every tear that had traced paths down her cheeks, every testament to love that had survived absence and miscommunication only to be defeated by honor and timing. And he found himself unable to sleep, for when he closed his eyes he saw her face, heard her whispered confession that she had tried to stop loving him and failed, felt again the impossible tension of standing close enough to touch the woman who owned his soul, while knowing she belonged irrevocably to another, and in darker moments, usually arriving near dawn, he contemplated departing England entirely, accepting a diplomatic post in some distant corner of the empire where he might not encounter reminders of what he had lost, though even as he entertained these thoughts, he knew that geography could not erase Eleanor from his heart any more than war and blood and frozen trenches had managed to accomplish that feat, for she was written into his very bones, and so he remained trapped in London, slowly starving himself through grief. While 50 miles distant Eleanor moved through her own days like a woman submerged in deep water, her movements slow and deliberate, her responses to questions delayed as though sound had to travel great distances to reach her, and she attended fittings for a wedding gown with the same expression she might have worn, attending a funeral, standing motionless as seamstresses pinned white silk around her frame and clucked about how thin she had become, how the dress would need to be taken in again before the ceremony. And at night, Eleanor lay in her bed and permitted herself the tears she suppressed during daylight hours, weeping into her pillow with her hand pressed against her mouth to muffle the sounds of her breaking. And she grieved not merely for the Duke, but for the version of herself that had existed before understanding the true nature of their separation, for the innocent woman who had believed herself abandoned rather than the tragic figure who now knew she had been loved all along, that every moment of her loneliness had been mirrored in his own suffering, and that they had both been faithful to something beautiful that cruel circumstance had destroyed. And the Viscount, who visited regularly to discuss wedding arrangements, began to notice the haunted quality in Eleanor's eyes, the way she startled when addressed as though her thoughts had been leagues distant, the mechanical nature of her responses to questions about flowers and music and guest lists, and though he was a kind man who genuinely cared for her happiness, he was not so observant that he could fail to mark the change that had come over her since the Duke's return, the way she seemed to be fading like a watercolor left too long in sunlight, becoming translucent and insubstantial, and he began to suspect with growing certainty that something had transpired between them that had altered everything, though Eleanor maintained her composure with such rigid determination that he could not bring himself to voice his concerns, and so they continued their strange dance toward a wedding that felt increasingly like a wake, both the Duke and Eleanor trapped in separate cells of their own honor, and their suffering invisible to the world yet absolute in its devastation, and neither could see a path forward that did not require the complete annihilation of everything they valued most. And so the days continued their merciless progression toward a future neither of them wanted, but both believed themselves powerless to prevent. The Viscount Harrington arrived at Eleanor's estate on an afternoon when spring rain fell in gentle sheets against the windows, and the butler showed him to the drawing-room where Eleanor sat with embroidery. She had not touched, lying forgotten in her lap, her gaze fixed on something beyond the glass that only she could see, and when she turned at his entrance, he saw in her face a confirmation of what he had begun to suspect over these past weeks, of watching her fade like cut flowers, denied water, and his heart, which had hoped against evidence, now accepted what his mind had already understood. But he was a man of substance and compassion rather than mere pride, and so he dismissed the servants with a quiet word and took the seat across from her and spoke with a gentleness that made Eleanor's eyes fill with tears she fought to contain, for he said simply that he had heard of the Duke of Ashford's return from the continent, that he had observed the change in her since that event, and that he would ask her one question to which he required only an honest answer rather than a polite deflection. And Eleanor's hands trembled in her lap as she nodded her assent, and the Viscount asked with devastating directness whether she loved another man. And in that moment, Eleanor discovered she could not lie to someone who had shown her nothing but kindness, even if the truth would wound him, and so she whispered, "Yes," with her voice breaking on that single syllable, and the Viscount sat very still for a long moment, while rain continued its soft percussion against the windows, and when he spoke again, His voice carried quiet heartbreak, but also a dignity that made Eleanor respect him even more deeply than she already had, for he told her that he had suspected as much, that he had hoped time and proximity might change her heart, but had watched her withdraw further with each passing day rather than growing closer, and he said, with profound sadness, but also conviction, that a marriage without love would be cruelty to them both, that he had no wish to bind her to vows she would speak from duty rather than devotion, that he valued her too highly to accept less than the whole of her heart, when he knew that heart belonged irrevocably to another, and Eleanor felt tears streaming freely now as she tried to speak, to tell him she would honor her commitment, that she would learn to be a good wife despite the circumstances. But the Viscount raised one hand to stop her words, and said with gentle firmness that he was releasing her from their engagement, that this decision was his to make, and he had made it out of genuine care for her happiness, rather than from any sense of rejection or wounded pride, for he could not in good conscience marry a woman who loved another, even if that woman was willing to sacrifice herself on the altar of honor and duty. And he rose then and crossed to where she sat and took her hand briefly in his, pressing it with warm affection, and told her that he hoped she would find the happiness she deserved with the man who held her heart, that some part of him would always treasure what they might have built together, but that he would rather see her genuinely happy with another than decorously miserable as his wife. And Eleanor could not speak through the tears that came now from gratitude and grief intermingled, for she had not expected such selfless generosity, such sacrifice born from authentic care rather than social obligation, and the Viscount took his leave quietly, pausing only at the door to say that he would make the announcement of their separation and take upon himself whatever social consequences might follow, that he would protect her reputation as much as possible, and then he was gone, leaving Eleanor alone in the drawing-room with rain falling and freedom suddenly restored, and the knowledge that the Viscount had given her what she had thought forever, lost the possibility of choosing love over duty, of following her heart, rather than merely honoring her word. The Viscount Harrington arrived at the Duke of Ashford's London townhouse on the morning following his conversation with Eleanor, and the butler who admitted him noted with concern the drawn quality of his master's face when informed of the visitor. For the two men had never met, despite their connection through the woman both had sought to marry, and when the Viscount was shown into the study, he found the Duke standing by the window, with the rigid posture of a man bracing for another blow, tension radiating from his frame like heat from forged steel, and for a long moment the two men regarded each other across the book-lined room with the wariness of soldiers meeting under uncertain flags, each taking measure of the other, the Duke seeing in his visitor's eyes genuine sorrow rather than the anger he might have expected, the Viscount observing in the Duke's haggard features the evidence of suffering that matched his own, and it was the Viscount who spoke first, his voice quiet but steady, as he said he had come to inform the Duke that the engagement to Lady Eleanor had been dissolved by mutual agreement, though in truth it had been his decision alone, and the Duke went utterly still at these words, his hand gripping the window frame as though it were all that kept him standing. And he asked in a voice rough with disbelief whether Eleanor knew of this visit, whether she had sent the Viscount to convey this news. But the Viscount shook his head and explained that Eleanor knew nothing of his presence here, that he had come of his own volition because there were things that needed to be said between them, and he told the Duke with devastating honesty that he had loved Eleanor as well as he was able, that he had hoped to make her happy, but that he had watched her fade like a candle guttering in its own wax since the Duke's return, had seen in her eyes a sorrow so profound it could only stem from loving another, and when he had asked her directly, she had confirmed what he already knew, that her heart belonged irrevocably to the man who stood before him now, and the Duke felt something break and reform in his chest, and hope flooding in where only despair had dwelt. But the Viscount continued speaking, and his tone took on steel beneath its sorrow, as he said that he had one request to make, not as a condition but as a plea from one man to another, and that was simply this, that the Duke prove himself worthy of the sacrifice being made, that he treat Eleanor with the devotion and constancy she deserved, that he never again, through carelessness or pride or misguided nobility, cause her the suffering she had endured these past months, for the Viscount said he could bear his own heartbreak if it meant Eleanor would find genuine happiness. But he could not bear to think his sacrifice had been for nothing, that she might suffer anew at the hands of the man she loved, and the Duke crossed the room then and extended his hand, meeting the Viscount's eyes with solemn intensity as he gave his word as a gentleman and a soldier that he would spend the remainder of his life honoring the gift he was being given, that he would cherish Eleanor with every breath he drew, that he understood the magnitude of what the Viscount had done and would prove worthy of it or die in the attempt. And the two men shook hands with the gravity of a sacred vow being sealed, and when the Viscount turned to leave, he paused at the door and withdrew from his pocket a small velvet box, and he told the Duke that Eleanor had returned this to him that morning, the betrothal ring he had given her, and that perhaps the Duke would see it returned to her under better circumstances than those which had seen it first bestowed, and he set the box on the desk and departed without another word, leaving the Duke alone with the small symbol of what might have been and what might yet be. And the Duke stood holding that velvet box and felt tears slip down his cheeks for the first time since childhood, gratitude and grief and hope all mingling in his chest, and he understood that he had been given a second chance purchased at the price of another man's happiness, a gift so precious it could only be honored through absolute devotion to the woman they both had loved. The Duke of Ashford arrived at Eleanor's estate as twilight descended over the countryside, painting the sky in shades of amber and violet that reminded him painfully of her eyes, and he found her in the drawing-room where a servant had announced him with visible surprise, for she had not expected any visitors, and certainly not him. And when she rose from her chair, he saw in her face a complex mixture of emotions, shock and wariness, and something that might have been hope struggling beneath layers of self-protection, and he requested with formal courtesy that seemed absurd given all that lay between them, whether she might consent to walk with him in the garden, the same garden where they had parted more than a year ago, and Eleanor hesitated for only a moment before nodding her assent and retrieving her shawl. And they walked in silence at first, down the gravel paths between rose bushes just beginning to leaf out with spring's promise, the air cool and carrying the scent of earth awakening. And finally the Duke stopped beside the stone bench where he had last held her hand and told her not to wait for him. Those words that had destroyed everything, and he turned to face her with his heart visible in his eyes and said that he had come to tell her something, that the Viscount had visited him that morning, and Eleanor felt her breath catch as the Duke continued speaking, his voice low and careful as though he feared the words themselves might shatter, and he told her that her engagement had been dissolved, that the Viscount had released her from all obligation, and he watched her face as comprehension dawned, followed by confusion, and then a fear that perhaps she had been abandoned twice now by men who claimed to care for her, and the Duke hastened to explain that the Viscount had acted from nobility rather than rejection, that he had understood Eleanor's heart belonged elsewhere and had chosen her happiness over his own desires, and the Duke reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box and opened it to reveal not his grandmother's ring that he had once given her, but rather the simpler band that the Viscount had bestowed, and he told Eleanor that the Viscount had entrusted him with its return, had asked him to see it placed in her hands under better circumstances, and Eleanor stared at the ring with tears gathering in her eyes as she understood the magnitude of what had been sacrificed on her behalf, and the Duke said quietly that he had come not to presume anything, not to claim her as though she were property to be transferred from one man to another, but rather to tell her that she was free, that no obligation bound her to anyone, that she could choose her own path forward, whether that path included him or not. And Eleanor looked up from the ring to meet his gaze, and saw in his face the evidence of suffering that matched her own, the shadows beneath his eyes, and the new lines carved by anguish and hope deferred. And she asked in a voice barely above a whisper what he wanted, what he hoped her choice might be, and the Duke told her with devastating honesty that he wanted the chance to begin again, to court her properly this time without the shadow of war or duty or misunderstanding between them, and to prove through patience and devotion that his love was constant, even if his words had once been careless, that he would spend whatever time she granted him, demonstrating that she could trust him with her heart, and Eleanor felt something that had been frozen, solid within her chest, begin to crack and shift, not breaking but rather thawing like ice yielding to spring sun, and she said that she was afraid, that she had built walls to protect herself from further pain, and did not know if she possessed the courage to lower them again, and the Duke nodded with understanding rather than frustration, and told her that he did not ask for her to trust him immediately, only that she allow him the opportunity to earn that trust day by day through constancy and care, And as they stood together in the gathering dusk, with possibility blooming between them, fragile and precious as the first flowers after winter, Eleanor felt hope return not as a sudden flood, but as a gentle, persistent spring seeping through stone. And she took the velvet box from his hands and closed her fingers around it and told him yes, she would grant him that chance. And the relief and joy that transformed the Duke's features was like watching the sun break through storm clouds, brilliant and warm and full of promise. The Duke began calling at Eleanor's estate 3 days after their conversation in the garden, arriving in the afternoon with her mother present as propriety demanded, and they sat in the drawing-room making careful conversation about inconsequential matters, while Eleanor's mother observed with shrewd eyes that missed nothing. The constraint of supervision, both frustrating and somehow reassuring in its recognition that they were beginning again from the beginning, not resuming where they had left off, but rather building something new upon the ruins of what had been. And the Duke brought flowers on his second visit, not roses, which might have seemed presumptuous given their romantic associations, but rather a bouquet of lavender and wildflowers that reminded Eleanor of the meadows near her childhood home, and with them came a note in his own hand, expressing simply his gratitude for her willingness to see him, the formality of it touching in its carefulness. And as days passed into weeks, the pattern established itself with the reliability of tides, his visits regular but never presuming, always respectful of her comfort and the boundaries she had erected around her wounded heart. And he spoke to her not of grand declarations or passionate avowals, but rather of small things, of books he had read and thoughts he had entertained, of his plans for improving his estate, and his hope to establish a school for the children of his tenants. And he asked her opinion on these matters with genuine interest in her perspective, treating her thoughts as valuable rather than decorative, and Eleanor found herself responding despite her determination to remain guarded, for his attention was not the distracted courtesy of a man going through requisite motions, but rather the focused engagement of someone who truly wished to know her mind and heart. And one afternoon he brought her a volume of poetry, not romantic verses but rather contemplative works by metaphysical poets. And he told her quietly that these had sustained him during his darkest hours on the continent, that when fear and despair threatened to overwhelm him, he had turned to Herbert and Donne, and found in their wrestling with faith and doubt a companionship in suffering. And this glimpse into his interior life moved Eleanor more than protestations of devotion might have done, for it showed her the man beneath the title, vulnerable and seeking meaning in the face of mortality. And as summer warmed, the gardens and roses bloomed in profusion along the estate's southern wall, Eleanor felt her careful guardedness beginning to soften, like wax near flame, not melting entirely, but becoming more pliable, less rigid in its self-protection. And the Duke seemed to sense this subtle shift, and responded not by pressing his advantage, but rather by maintaining his patient consistency, proving through steady devotion that he understood trust must be earned through time, rather than claimed through right. And Eleanor caught herself looking forward to his visits, with an eagerness she had thought herself incapable of feeling again, and she began to share more of herself in turn, speaking of the loneliness she had endured during his absence, and the hollow months of her engagement to the Viscount. And the Duke listened with an attention so complete it felt like a form of tenderness, and he told her with quiet sorrow that he would carry the guilt of having caused her such pain for the remainder of his life, that his careless words had wounded her in ways 1,000 careful ones might never fully heal, but that he hoped through patience and constancy to prove himself worthy of a second chance. And in these conversations, conducted under her mother's watchful supervision, something precious began to grow between them, not the passionate intensity of their first courtship, but rather something deeper and more durable, a foundation built on honest communication and mutual respect, and Eleanor felt hope taking root in soil she had thought rendered barren by grief. The afternoon had been warm and pleasant when the Duke arrived for his customary visit, but by the time Eleanor's mother excused herself to attend to correspondence, the sky had darkened ominously, and within minutes rain began to fall in sheets that transformed the windows into rivers of distortion, and the Duke suggested they remove to the conservatory where the sound of rain on glass created a peculiar intimacy, a cocoon of water and greenery that seemed to exist outside the normal boundaries of the drawing-room's formality, and they walked together down the corridor without speaking, the drumming of the storm above them filling the silence, and once inside the conservatory with its humid air and the scent of jasmine and orchids, they stood for a moment, simply listening to the violence of weather against the protection of walls and roof, and Eleanor felt something shift in the atmosphere between them, a lowering of guards that had remained stubbornly raised despite weeks of careful courtship, and the Duke turned to her and said, with a vulnerability she had not yet heard from him, that he had not slept properly since his return from the continent, that when he closed his eyes he saw not her face as he wished, but rather the faces of men who had died under his command, and Eleanor felt her breath catch at this confession, for he had spoken of the war only in abstract terms before this moment, and she told him quietly that she understood something of sleepless nights, that during the months of his absence she had lain awake, constructing elaborate narratives of his death in 100 different forms, and the Duke looked at her with such anguish that she reached for his hand without thinking, her fingers closing around his, and he gripped her hand as though it were the only solid thing in a world gone liquid and uncertain, and he told her that the worst moments had not been the battles themselves, but rather the quiet hours afterward when he had to write letters to widows and mothers, that he had thought of her during those times, and wondered whether someone might someday write such a letter about him, and Eleanor felt tears gathering as she admitted that she had imagined receiving such a letter countless times, that the not knowing had been a form of torture more acute than confirmed grief might have been, and the Duke pulled her gently toward one of the iron benches, and they sat together, still holding hands, while rain continued its relentless percussion overhead, and he told her about the nightmares that plagued him, the sounds and smells that invaded his sleep, and she told him about the hollow emptiness that had consumed her, the way she had felt herself becoming a ghost, haunting her own life. And in this exchange of intimate pain, something profound occurred between them, for they were no longer trading polite observations or careful courtesies, but rather exposing the rawest parts of themselves to each other's witness, and Eleanor realized that intellectual understanding of suffering was entirely different from this visceral sharing of wounds, and she felt the last rigid walls around her heart beginning to crack, not from assault, but from the gentle, persistent pressure of genuine connection, and the Duke lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her fingers with such tenderness that she felt tears spill over, and he told her that if she would grant him the privilege, he would spend the remainder of his life ensuring she never felt such loneliness again, and Eleanor looked into his eyes and saw, reflected there, not just desire or devotion, but true comprehension of what she had endured, and she told him that she was no longer afraid, or rather that she was afraid but willing to be brave, and they sat together as the storm gradually exhausted itself, and light began to filter through the breaking clouds, neither speaking now but both understanding that something essential had shifted between them, that they had moved from careful reconstruction toward genuine reunion, and when her mother found them still sitting hand in hand in the conservatory, she saw immediately what had transpired, and smiled with quiet satisfaction. The drawing-room at Montclair House blazed with candlelight, and hummed with the polished conversation of London's elite, and Eleanor stood at the Duke's side, feeling the weight of 100 speculative gazes upon them, like physical pressure, for this was their first public appearance together, since the scandal of her broken engagement had rippled through society's carefully ordered circles, and she could hear the whispers that followed them like shadows, the phrases catching at the edge of hearing about the Duke's convenient timing and her supposed fickleness, and speculation about what manner of woman would break faith with one honorable man to pursue another, and her mother had counseled her that morning to perhaps delay their public debut until memory of the Viscount's humiliation had faded somewhat, but the Duke had insisted with quiet determination that he would not have Eleanor suffer society's censure alone. And so here they stood in the midst of judgment, both subtle and overt, and Lady Pemberton swept past with a deliberately cold nod that spoke volumes about her disapproval, and Mrs. Hertford paused in her conversation to stare with undisguised curiosity before whispering urgently to her companion, and Eleanor felt her courage wavering beneath the assault of society's sharp-edged scrutiny until the Duke's hand found hers with gentle pressure, and he leaned close enough that she could feel the warmth of his breath, and against her ear, as he whispered that she was the bravest person he had ever known, and that he was honored to stand beside her, and something in his steady presence fortified her, so that when Lord Berkshire approached with thinly veiled questions about the circumstances of her change of heart, She met his gaze directly and told him with perfect composure that matters of the heart were rarely simple, and that she was grateful for the Viscount's understanding and generosity of spirit, and the Duke added with unmistakable firmness that Lady Eleanor had conducted herself with integrity and honor throughout, and that anyone who suggested otherwise would answer to him personally, and there was such steel beneath the courtesy of his words that Lord Berkshire paled slightly and retreated with hasty apologies, and as the evening progressed, Eleanor observed how the Duke navigated society's treacherous currents with a skill born of rank and confidence, deflecting improper questions with gracious evasion, and making clear through posture and proximity that his intentions toward her were entirely honorable, and that he would brook no disrespect to her character, and gradually she felt herself relaxing into the strength of their partnership, understanding that they were facing this trial together rather than as isolated individuals. And when they took to the floor for the first waltz, she felt every eye in the room upon them, but found she no longer cared what judgment those eyes contained, for in the circle of the Duke's arms, with his hand steady at her waist, and his eyes holding hers with unwavering certainty, she felt safe from the storm of speculation that swirled around them, and he told her, as they moved through the measured steps of the dance, that he had never been more proud to stand with anyone, and that whatever price society demanded for their happiness, he would pay it gladly, and Eleanor felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, but blinked them back, and told him that she had learned through bitter experience that love worth having was love worth fighting for, and she would face 1,000 disapproving glances for the gift of his companionship, and as the music swelled and carried them through the final turns of the waltz, she caught sight of her mother watching from the sidelines with an expression of mingled concern and approval, and she understood that her mother saw what she herself had come to recognize, that true partnership meant standing together against the world's judgment rather than bending to its arbitrary dictates. And when the dance concluded, and the Duke led her from the floor with her hand resting on his arm, she held her head high and met each curious or censorious gaze with calm dignity, and she knew that whatever trials lay ahead, they would face them as they faced this evening, united in purpose and strengthened by the bond that had been tested and refined through separation and suffering, and finally chosen deliberately and courageously, despite all obstacles. Autumn returned with its familiar burden of gold and crimson leaves, and the Duke invited Eleanor to a private dinner at his London residence, with a formality that suggested something momentous lay ahead, and she arrived, as twilight painted the sky in shades of amber and violet, to find the dining room transformed into an intimate sanctuary, with candles casting warm light across damask and crystal, and they sat across from each other at the small table he had chosen instead of the grand one that could seat 20. And through the first courses they spoke of inconsequential things, with a nervous energy that belied the significance. Both felt gathering like a storm on the horizon, and when the servants had cleared the final plates and withdrawn, the Duke rose from his chair and came to kneel beside her, with such unexpected humility that Eleanor felt her breath catch in her throat, and he took her hand in both of his, and looked up at her with eyes that held both hope and fear in equal measure. And he told her that he had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in his mind, but now found himself unable to recall a single, carefully crafted phrase, and so he would speak plainly from his heart, if she would permit him, and Eleanor nodded wordlessly as tears already began to gather at the corners of her eyes, and the Duke told her that he was a flawed man, who had made grievous mistakes born of pride and poor judgment, that his careless words had nearly destroyed the greatest gift he had ever been offered, and he had learned through bitter experience that love was not something to be taken for granted or treated with anything less than the reverence it deserved, and he asked not whether she would accept him as he had once presumed she would, but rather whether she would take a chance on a man who had been broken and remade by war and loss, and who understood now that her happiness must be his first concern in all things, and he told her that if she would consent to be his wife, he would spend every remaining day of his life proving himself worthy of the second chance she had already granted him, simply by allowing him back into her presence, and Eleanor felt the tears spilling freely now as she looked down at this proud man, kneeling before her with such vulnerability and courage, and she told him with a voice that trembled with emotion that she had learned something too, through their separation and suffering, that she had discovered she could survive loneliness and grief and loss, but that she did not wish merely to survive when the possibility of truly living stood before her. And she told him that she was afraid because love had the power to wound as deeply as it could heal, but that she had also learned that a life lived in fear of pain was no life at all, and she would rather risk her heart again with him than guard it safely behind walls that would keep out joy as surely as sorrow. And she said yes, with such certainty that the words seemed to resonate in the candle-lit room, like a bell proclaiming hope's triumph over despair. And the Duke rose and drew her to her feet, and looked at her with such intensity that she felt she might dissolve beneath the heat of his gaze, and he cupped her face in his hands with infinite gentleness and asked if he might kiss her, and she answered by closing the distance between them and pressing her lips to his in a kiss that began tentative and careful, as though they were both afraid of shattering something precious, but which deepened and intensified as all the longing and desire and love that had been denied and deferred through months of careful courtship finally found expression. And Eleanor felt herself melting into his embrace as his arms encircled her and drew her close, and in that kiss she tasted salt from tears. She did not know whether were his or hers or both, and she felt the racing of his heart against her own, and understood that this moment was the true beginning of their story, that everything that had come before had been preparation for this choosing of each other, not from duty or arrangement, but from hard-won wisdom and deliberate courage and faith in the possibility of happiness earned through suffering. The chapel at Ashford Estate stood modest and ancient, with its Norman arches and weathered stone, warmed by winter sunlight, streaming through windows of coloured glass, and Eleanor stood in the small vestibule with her father's arm beneath her hand, listening to the murmur of voices from the handful of guests assembled within. And this was not the grand ceremony they had once planned, with hundreds of London's elite filling a cathedral's vast spaces, but rather something intimate and precious made more meaningful by its simplicity, and her gown was white silk, without excessive ornamentation, elegant in its restraint, and she wore in her hair the single strand of pearls that had belonged to her grandmother, and her father looked at her with eyes bright with unshed tears, and told her that he had never seen her more beautiful or more certain, and she smiled at him through her own gathering emotion, and told him that she was ready, that she had never been more ready for anything in her life. And the chapel doors opened, and she saw the Duke standing at the altar, in his formal attire with his shoulders squared and his hands clasped before him. And when his eyes found hers across the small space, she saw them widen and soften with such wonder that her heart felt it might burst from her chest, and she walked toward him down the short aisle, past the faces of those few people whose presence mattered most, her mother dabbing at tears with a lace handkerchief, the Duke's sister smiling with radiant approval, and there in the third pew the Viscount sat with quiet dignity, and when Eleanor's gaze met his he nodded with genuine blessing, and she felt gratitude wash through her for his generosity of spirit. And then she reached the altar, and her father placed her hand in the Duke's, and she felt the slight tremor in his fingers that told her he was as moved as she. And the vicar began the ancient words of the ceremony, with his voice resonant in the stone space. And outside, rain had begun to fall in gentle patters against the leaded windows, and when the moment came for the Duke to speak his vows, his voice broke on the words about honoring and cherishing her for all the days of his life, and he had to pause and collect himself before he could continue, and Eleanor felt tears sliding down her own cheeks as she listened to this proud man lay bare his heart before God and these witnesses, and when her turn came, she spoke her promises with such clarity and conviction that her voice seemed to fill the chapel, and she told him that she took him as her husband freely and joyfully, choosing him as he had chosen her. And the vicar pronounced them married, and the Duke's hands cupped her face with infinite tenderness as he kissed her with a reverence that made the simple act feel sacred, and as they turned to walk back down the aisle together, Eleanor noticed that the rain had ceased, and sunlight was breaking through the clouds to pour through the coloured glass in shafts of ruby and sapphire and gold, and she took it as a benediction from heaven itself, and when they emerged from the chapel into air washed clean by rain, she looked up at her husband and saw her own joy reflected in his eyes, and she understood that this beginning was sweeter for all the sorrow that had preceded it, that the happiness they had found was precious, precisely because it had been fought for and nearly lost, and finally reclaimed through courage and faith and the willingness to risk their hearts one final time. The first months of their marriage unfolded like the careful opening of a flower long denied the sun, and they moved through the rooms of Ashford Estate, learning each other anew in the intimate spaces of shared domesticity, and Eleanor discovered that her husband had habits both endearing and perplexing, such as his tendency to wake before dawn and walk the grounds, regardless of weather. And the Duke learned that his wife possessed a sharp wit that emerged most brilliantly over breakfast when she was fully awake, and that she had strong opinions about estate management, which proved invariably sound when he swallowed his pride enough to implement them, and there were moments of awkwardness as they navigated the physical intimacy of marriage, both carrying wounds that made vulnerability difficult. But Eleanor found in her husband a gentleness that belied his military bearing, and a patience that allowed her to come to him in her own time, and the Duke discovered in his wife a passion that had been carefully hidden beneath layers of propriety and pain, and their love-making became a language through which they spoke truths too deep for words. And yet it was not all ease and joy, for the Duke's nights were frequently troubled by dreams that sent him bolt upright in their bed, with sweat dampening his skin and terror glazing his eyes. And Eleanor learned to wake with him and hold him until the trembling ceased and reality reasserted itself, and she did not press him to speak of what he had seen in those foreign fields, but simply offered her presence as an anchor to pull him back from whatever dark waters threatened to drown him. And one afternoon, while organizing the library, she discovered a leather-bound journal tucked behind a row of books, and opening it, she found page after page in her husband's distinctive hand, and the dates showed it had been kept during his time at war, and she read with tears streaming down her face as she discovered that nearly every entry mentioned her, some merely a line about how he wondered what she was doing at that moment, others longer passages describing memories of their courtship or imagining the life they would build together when he returned. And there was an entry written the night before a major battle where he had recorded a letter to her in case he did not survive. And the words were so raw with love and regret that Eleanor had to set the journal aside and compose herself before she could continue, and when the Duke found her there with the journal open in her lap, he went pale, thinking she might be angry at this invasion of his private thoughts. But she simply stood and crossed to him, and took his face in her hands, and told him that reading those pages had shown her the constancy of his heart, even when circumstances had conspired to make her doubt it, and she thanked him for carrying her with him through those dark times. And he gathered her into his arms and confessed that thoughts of her had been what sustained him when all else seemed lost, and they stood together in the library's quiet as afternoon light slanted through the windows. And Eleanor understood that they were building something stronger than the romance of their initial courtship, that this marriage was founded not on the giddy passion of youth, but on the deeper knowing that came from having faced the worst and chosen each other anyway. The summons arrived on a morning in late spring when the gardens were heavy with the scent of roses, and Eleanor had been arranging flowers in the drawing room with hands that had learned to move with contentment rather than merely occupation, and the Duke had taken the letter from his study into the morning room where she sat, and his expression told her that something significant had occurred before he spoke a word, and he explained that the Foreign Office required his presence on the continent for a diplomatic mission related to the ongoing peace negotiations, that his experience and connections from the war made him uniquely suited to facilitate certain delicate discussions, and Eleanor felt her chest constrict with a fear so immediate and visceral that it transported her instantly back to that morning years ago when he had departed for war, and she set down the vase she had been holding with fingers that trembled despite her efforts at composure, and the Duke saw the color drain from her face and crossed to her immediately, kneeling beside her chair and taking her hands in his, and he told her that he understood her fear, that he felt it himself, that the thought of leaving her even briefly caused him physical pain, but then his expression shifted into something she had not anticipated, and he asked her if she would consider accompanying him, and Eleanor looked at him with surprise evident in her widened eyes, and he continued speaking with words that came rapidly as though he had rehearsed this argument, telling her that he had sworn never to leave her behind again, that whatever duties took him from England could and would include her if she were willing, that he would not repeat the mistakes of the past by allowing separation to breed fear and miscommunication, and Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest as she understood what he was offering, and she thought of the young woman she had been, who had waited in gardens and empty halls, who had counted days and passed letters for hidden meanings, who had nearly lost everything because neither of them had possessed the courage to insist on togetherness. And she looked at her husband, kneeling before her with hope and determination, mingling in his expression, and she realized that this was a test of everything they had learned, that he was asking her to be brave enough to step into his world rather than remaining safely behind in hers. And the old Eleanor might have refused from fear or propriety, might have told him to go while she maintained the home, but she had been forged in fires of loss and reclamation into someone stronger, and she squeezed his hands and told him, yes, that she would go with him, that wherever he went she would follow, because their marriage was a partnership, and partnerships required sharing both comfort and challenge. And she saw relief flood his features, followed by something like pride, and he pulled her into his arms and held her with fierce gratitude. And in the weeks that followed they prepared for the journey together, and Eleanor felt trepidation, certainly as she had never travelled beyond England's shores. But she also felt excitement at the prospect of seeing the places he had described in his letters and journals, and when the day came to depart, she stood beside him on the deck of the ship, watching England's white cliffs recede into morning mist, and his arm was around her waist, anchoring her, as the vessel cut through grey-green waters toward the continent. And she understood that they had transformed their greatest weakness into their greatest strength, that by refusing to be separated, they had proven that the past held no power over their present, and the journey itself became a kind of honeymoon, as they discovered foreign cities together, and she attended diplomatic functions at his side, wearing elegant gowns, and learning to navigate the subtle currents of international politics, and in quiet moments in their lodgings, he would tell her how having her present steadied him in ways he could not fully articulate, and she would respond that being included in this part of his life made her feel truly known and valued. And when the mission concluded successfully, and they made their way back to England, she reflected that the test had been passed, not because nothing had gone wrong, but because they had faced uncertainty together rather than apart. 5 years had passed since their wedding day, and the estate had been transformed from a place of quiet melancholy into something vibrant and alive, with the sound of children's laughter echoing through halls that had once known only Eleanor's solitary footsteps, and the Duke and Duchess of Ashford had been blessed with 3 children in rapid succession, 2 daughters with their mother's dark hair and thoughtful eyes, and a son who possessed his father's determined jaw and gentle disposition, and the gardens where Eleanor had once waited in anguished hope now served as a wonderland for small adventurers who built fairy houses beneath the rose bushes and chased butterflies across the manicured lawns, and the Duke had proven himself as devoted a father as he was a husband, often abandoning his study in the afternoons to join in games of hide-and-seek, or to tell elaborate stories that made his children shriek with delighted terror, and Eleanor would watch from the terrace with her hand resting on her heart, as she witnessed the man who had survived war's brutality, kneeling in the grass to examine a beetle with his youngest daughter, and she had grown into her role as Duchess with a confidence that surprised even herself, managing the estate's affairs with skill and implementing improvements to the tenants' cottages that earned her genuine affection from those who lived on Ashford lands, and the nightmares that had once plagued her husband's sleep had diminished to rare occurrences, and when they did surface, Eleanor still woke with him and held him until peace returned. And on a golden afternoon in late summer, when the estate was preparing for the harvest festival, a carriage arrived, bearing the Viscount Harrington and his wife, a spirited woman with red hair and an infectious laugh, whom he had married 3 years prior, and Eleanor greeted them with genuine warmth, for time had transmuted what might have been awkwardness into authentic friendship, and over tea in the drawing-room, while the children played in the next room, under the watchful eye of their nurse, the 4 adults spoke of their lives with the ease of people who had found their proper places, and the Viscount's wife, who knew the history between her husband and the Duchess, showed no jealousy, but rather curiosity about how such a tangled situation had resolved so well for all parties, and Eleanor caught the Viscount's eye across the table, and saw in his expression nothing but contentment and the satisfaction of a man who had made a difficult choice and found it had led him to exactly where he needed to be. And later, when the visit concluded, and the Duke walked with Eleanor through the gardens as evening descended, they found themselves standing in the very spot where he had told her not to wait for him all those years ago, and she remarked on how strange it was that those words which had caused such anguish had ultimately led them on a path that strengthened rather than weakened what they shared. And he gathered her into his arms and told her that he believed some things needed to be broken before they could be properly mended, that their love had been tested in fires that would have consumed a lesser bond, but had instead forged them into something unbreakable. And Eleanor rested her head against his chest and listened to the steady beat of his heart, and felt such overwhelming gratitude for the journey they had traveled that tears pricked her eyes, and in the distance she could hear their children's voices calling for them, and the Duke smiled and took her hand, and together they walked back toward the house, where light spilled from every window in welcome. The evening had descended with that particular quality of golden light that transforms ordinary landscapes into something transcendent, and the Duke and Eleanor sat together on the stone bench in the garden where so much of their story had unfolded, watching as the sun painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, while their children played their final games before being called inside for supper, and Eleanor leaned against her husband's shoulder with the comfortable intimacy of two people who had earned their peace through trial and perseverance, and the Duke remarked that he sometimes still could not believe the fullness of the life they had built together, that there were moments when he woke in the morning and felt overwhelming gratitude for the second chance they had been granted, and Eleanor lifted her head to look at him and told him that she believed the pain they had endured had been necessary for the joy they now possessed, that people who found happiness easily perhaps did not value it as deeply as those who had nearly lost everything before claiming it. And he took her hand and brought it to his lips and said that he would endure it all again if it meant arriving at this moment. And they sat in companionable silence as the sky deepened and the first stars began to emerge, and Eleanor thought of the young woman she had been, who had stood in this very garden, waiting for a man who had told her not to wait, and she marveled at the journey that had brought her from that moment of abandonment to this present fullness. And the Duke seemed to sense the direction of her thoughts, for he said softly that those 3 words he had spoken in haste and fear had nearly destroyed them both, but had ultimately taught them the most important lesson of their lives. That love required not just feeling but action, not just devotion but communication, not just promises but presence, and Eleanor nodded against his shoulder and felt such contentment that it seemed to radiate from her very bones. Dear listener, consider, if you will, the delicate machinery of human connection and how easily it can be damaged by words spoken without full consideration of their weight, and understand that the Duke and Eleanor's story teaches us that timing is never as fixed as we imagine, and that second chances exist for those brave enough to claim them, despite fear and despite the judgment of others who cannot. Understand what beats within our hearts, and know that communication is the foundation upon which all enduring love must be built for. Without it, we are left to interpret and assume and fill silence with our worst imaginings rather than simple truth, and remember that sometimes the words which wound us most deeply are spoken not from cruelty but from fear, and that grace requires us to look beyond the surface, meaning to the frightened heart beneath. And if you find yourself waiting for someone who has asked you not to wait, then question whether they truly meant dismissal or whether they were simply trying to protect you from their own uncertainty. And if you are the one who speaks words of release when your heart screams the opposite, then find the courage to return and speak your truth before silence becomes an unbridgeable chasm, and understand that love worth having is love worth fighting for, even when society whispers scandal and even when pride suggests retreat. For the Duke and Eleanor found their happiness not through perfect circumstances, but through imperfect people, choosing again and again to be brave enough to try. May you know the peace that comes from honest words spoken in trust. May you find the courage to fight for what your heart knows to be true. May you grant grace to those who stumble in their expression of love. And may you rest tonight, knowing that no mistake is beyond redemption and no separation beyond healing, if both hearts remain willing to reach across the distance. This story comes to you from Love and Loyalty, where tales of the heart remind us that our greatest strength lies not in avoiding pain, but in choosing love, despite it. And if this story touched something within you, then share it with someone who needs to remember that second chances are real, and that patience and faith can transform even the most broken beginnings into beautiful endings.